Yeah, I know, the prevailing consensus on Star Citzen is that the performance is unstable and buggy and therefore it's not worth benchmarking. But the fact of the matter is that there are a whole lot of people out there, including myself, who are still interested to know whether or not an upgrade would make a difference in boosting Star Citizen's famously low frame rates. Spoiler alert, it definitely makes a huge difference, and I have the receipts to back it up. So then what did I mean by the title of the video about not wasting your money upgrading your PC for Star Citzen? Well, what I was talking about there is not wasting your money on the wrong thing, because it does matter how you upgrade if you're on a budget, like how you might be better off upgrading your GPU first, or how better memory will actually help you a lot more than you might think, and how popular suggestions for upgrade paths may actually have you wasting your money if all you want to do is cruise the verse. So then in this video, I'm going to take you through what I've discovered this past week over hours upon hours of testing the new RTX 4090 paired with an AMD 7900X against my older RTX 3090 and Intel 10900K, the fallen king of gaming frames. I'll share how I've discovered how you might not actually need to upgrade to a new CPU, and that benchmarking is actually super duper painful and thankless, and I really don't want to do this anymore, and I don't at all envy any of the tech YouTubers who do it. Now I have greater respect for them because, oh my gosh, this is painful. But anyway, I hope I'll at least have saved you guys a few bucks and headaches by the end of it. And if I did, and you think I deserve it, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button to let me know. It really helps out the channel and, well, I personally appreciate it. So then I hope you'll join me on this exploration of performance, just like how you can explore new worlds with the sponsor of today's video, Audible, who help make videos like these possible, where I spend way too much time preparing than is worth it probably for my finances. But hey, I like doing this, so it's worth it. Anyway, so with my day job and with this YouTube/streaming thing, I can't really find the time to sit down and read much anymore. And that's why I really love Audible. It helps me escape some of that stress while I'm working out or while I'm on the way to the studio with amazing audiobooks like the Stormlight series. Yep, I'm recommending this yet again because it's actually really amazing. It stuck with me as one of my favorite stories probably ever. So head on over to audible.com/morphologist and use code morphologist or text morphologist to 500 to get the first book in the series, The Way of Kings, free and start your 30-day free Audible membership trial. If the Stormlight audiobook series, though, doesn't strike your fancy, you can check out any number of their other fantastic audiobooks like The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, with the extra 1 credit you'll get towards any audiobook every month as a member. So what are you waiting for? Go check it out. It's really cool. So first and foremost, I most certainly am not a professional tech YouTuber. I don't really have the resources to buy and test a bunch of parts, or even have the space to test it if I could get those parts. However, what I do have are a selection of high-end parts and the know-how to swap them around and record some differences. And of course, I have the will to do it because not many people want to actually test Star Citzen. I mean, professional tech YouTubers won't, because let's be honest, it's probably really not worth their time. But my time is kind of worthless, so let's go. For the methodology of my testing, in order to develop a clearer picture of the overall performance of Star Citzen, I had to develop a test regimen that could effectively reduce the role of Star Citzen's engine instability because it plays a big role in performance results. I decided to take the large sample pool approach, where I selected a series of 14 different real-world scenes in the persistent universe, spread across Star Citzen's toughest performance locations: Orison, Area 18, Lorville, and New Babbage. I tried my best to replicate each scene, but unfortunately the time of day was one of the most difficult parts to match, as it is synced between all servers. This meant that I needed to wait for several hours in some cases just to re-record, and in the end I decided it just was close enough. It didn't really seem to matter though anyway, as day and night cycles didn't actually seem to affect performance meaningfully, and the large pool I sampled should at least mitigate some of the outlying results I might get. It's also worth noting that Star Citizen performance instability is also inherent to its gameplay design. Sometimes players will gather in large numbers or leave large amounts of garbage around, which can really affect performance a lot. This is again why I believe a larger sample pool is necessary. After I collected the average, high, and 1% low for each scene, I created an average then for each location suite. I'll be taking you through each test scene, but I'll be shortening it for the sake of not making this video too long. It's a lot of footage and it would take like 20 minutes to go over all of it, I think. So for testing, I'll be using my Intel 10900K overclocked to 5.2 GHz with 64 gigs of 3600 MHz CL16 memory and a Strix 3090 stock clock GPU. For the newer computer, I'll be using the new AMD 7900X with performance boost mode set to enabled in the BIOS, coupled with 64 gigs of 5200 MHz CL40 memory and a TUF 4090 OC edition card. I've also swapped the 3090 into the AMD computer for one series of tests just to understand whether or not just upgrading your CPU would make a difference in performance. Unfortunately, I couldn't fit my 4090 into my old case, and even if I could, the 850 watt power supply wouldn't have been enough to really feed it. I also decided to use Cyberpunk as a bit of a control test to see whether or not performance was different between these different rig setups. The game has come a long way since release, so I know some of you might be thinking, well, it's not a very optimized engine, but they have had like a year now to work on it, and it's pretty stable at this point. I've seen it used in a number of benchmarks like with J2 Sense and Gamers Nexus, so I think we can safely say that it's good enough to at least have somewhat of a basis in reality. So starting off with the Cyberpunk control test with everything set to high or very high with ray tracing set to psycho, performance for the 3090 and 4090 are both impressive, but it's clear that the 4090 is leagues ahead now with nearly double the frame rates in my DLSS 2 quality test. Interestingly, it looks like the 7900X platform only nominally improves performance with 3090. Results from my DLSS off test, meaning native resolution, near 4K shebang, or similar. The 4090 gets nearly double the frames the 3090 does. That's a massive generational leap. So let's move on then to Star Citizen and see if we see similar results. And by the way, everything in Star Citizen has been set to very high, motion blur has been turned off, and clouds are importantly set to very high. This seems to be the largest factor in performance, in case you were wondering, so if you are getting poor frames, make sure to turn that down to medium or completely off. So let's start with the new Babbage Test suite. Here I tested the transit system as it provided an easily repeatable moving scenario where I can replicate you driving or flying around in the city. I mixed that with some interior and exterior spaces to get a good balance. The 10900K with the 3090 and the 7900X with the 3090 tests, which I'll refer to here on out as PC1 and PC2, both seem to have been GPU bottlenecked, indicated by the near 100% GPU utilization. Interestingly though, the 7900X and 4090 combo, which I'll refer to here as PC3, shows the 7900X is actually bottlenecking the 4090. Pay attention to the blue bar, which is the average FPS. The averaged results here show near identical performance with the 3090 in both PC1 and PC2, with PC3 and its 4090 pulling way ahead. This is then similar to what we saw in Cyberpunk. So then let's move on to Lorville and see what happens. I found very similar results here to New Babbage, where it looks like PC1 and PC2 are being limited by the GPU's performance, leaving PC3 to be limited by the 7900X performance with its incredibly fast 4090. The average results here once again bear this out. Again, similar to Cyberpunk. Next is the ArcCorp suite, which is notable for being the only city that doesn't yet have volumetric clouds. This yielded some more interesting results than expected, where the interior tests at the spaceport showed PC1 and PC2 to be GPU bound, and PC3 to be CPU bottlenecked. But this changed on the tram ride and bridge scenes where all three PCs became CPU bottlenecked. This really starts to demonstrate the areas where Star Citizen can be improved with its environments and how they're rendered, as they're not really well optimized. ArcCorp is, after all, one of the older cities. The developers have also discussed how the render thread is a limiting factor here, and it's one of the things that they're working on with their new Gen 12 update and integration of the Vulkan API. So looking at the average results then, the performance differences are rather minor, where a 60 FPS plus average was achieved for all three PCs. Next though is the legendary Port Olisar, which is literally the opposite of ArcCorp, being a mostly space location. The performance results are also then really the opposite here, where near 100% GPU utilization was recorded for all three PCs, indicating that space is a mostly GPU-bound environment. This is something that I guessed before the video, but it's nice to have some confirmation. As such, performance results are predictable, with PC 1 and 2 being nearly identical with higher potential frame rates on PC 2. And PC 3 is just pulling away here with insanely high average FPS, for Star Citizen at least, with an average frame rate of 102 FPS. Again, this is for Star Citizen, it's not like CSGO. There's a lot more going on here and a lot of optimization they can do. Finally though, we arrive at our final destination, Orison, the nemesis of all baller rigs. Crusader is a gas giant, and as such, the entire planet is composed of volumetric clouds. As one might imagine, performance here, of all locations, will suffer the most with clouds on, even at its lowest settings. So, for all PCs in this test, the location was entirely GPU bound, like extremely heavily GPU bound. Results were pretty abysmal for PC 1 and 2 on very high settings, barely managing over 20 FPS for both rigs. PC 3 also struggles here, but nearly doubles performance, a trend we once again see from the control test we did with Cyberpunk. Looking at the average results then, despite the location being GPU bound, here we see a slight lead with PC 2's superior 7900X CPU. But with a difference of just 2 FPS, it's negligible and could be considered within the margin of error. But what about the overall performance? How does all of this stack up? This is really what I was aiming towards with doing all of these tests, to really find out if there is any performance uplift. Well, here are the results. With PC 1's older 10900K and 3090 combo, it still managed a pretty respectable showing as far as Star Citizen's terrible performance is concerned. 43 average FPS isn't great, but it's playable at 4K, at least for me. And also just remember that this number isn't really reflective of performance in specific places where it's GPU bound, where performance can increase pretty substantially, as we saw with our test at Port Olisar. The big surprise though isn't that the 4090 in the 7900X is incredible, being 40.8% faster than the 10900K comboed with the 3090. It's instead that the 7900X paired with the 3090 for PC2 only managed an average 1.3% performance uplift. That is not at all what I expected, especially considering that the 7900X is twice as fast as the 10900K in a lot of benchmarks. Now, before we move on to my conclusions and recommendations, one thing that occurred to me, as I'm sure it did to you, is that Star Citizen is CPU bound in a lot of conditions, and so you might think that it might be beneficial to switch to a faster set of memory, going from, say 5200 to 6000, and that's exactly what I did. I traded my CL40 5200 memory for some CL36 6000 memory with AMD's new Expo feature, which basically helps it optimize the memory's performance. After installing it and making sure the settings were correct, I returned to the Cyberpunk control and disappointingly discovered that there was virtually no performance difference between the two PCs. But let's think about this for a second. Cyberpunk is pretty heavily GPU bound, so we might yet still see some performance uplift in Star Citizen, so let's go check that out. Well, after running through literally every single test again, which took me yet another half day, it appears the 6000 mega transfers per second memory yielded 12.77% more performance than the 5200 MHz memory, bringing the performance gain of PC3 up to 53.6% faster than the 10900K on average with its 3090. Not too bad. So with this data, I'm sure many of you will be able to come to some pretty interesting conclusions that I probably won't come to. which I encourage you to share down below. Like I said, I'm not super good with this, so I'm excited to see what you guys think. However, with what I do know here, I think I can come up with some pretty good closing thoughts and suggestions for those of you looking to upgrade. So first and foremost, the most obvious conclusion is that the 4090 and 7900X together most certainly drastically improve performance in Star Citizen on average, along with pretty much every other game out there. I mean, I was running ray tracing at native resolution at nearly 50 FPS average. That's insane, especially at nearly 4K. Also, somewhat unexpected was the performance uplift from having faster memory. It was about 12.7% faster. That's not a small amount. However, the real surprise here is that it appears that the prevailing assumption that Star Citizen is a CPU-bound game is only partially true. Star Citizen alternates between being CPU and GPU bound depending on location, with most locations actually being GPU bound. This was made evident by the lack of meaningful performance uplift when I swapped the 3090 into the 7900X platform. But I think it's important here not to overlook that the 10900K is actually still a pretty dang good gaming CPU, as these results show that it let the 3090 breathe freely, allowing it to run at 100%. This then leads me to the following suggestion. If you're still sitting on a 10th gen or 5000 series AMD equivalent or higher end CPU, then your gaming CPU still has a lot of life in it. From what I've seen here, with it not restricting the 3090, there's still some headroom for looking into a GPU upgrade, leaving the more expensive platform upgrade for later down the line if you're running on a budget. Well, I couldn't fit my 4090 into my 10900K's case, and I couldn't even power it if I could. I'm certain that I would have seen a nice performance jump in all of these tests had I gotten a bigger case and modern PSU with the new 12-pin connector. The PSU and a new case would have been far less expensive than moving to a whole new computer. One other thing to note here is that while I don't have the performance test here to show you, I have also noticed an appreciable difference between 3000 MHz memory and 3600 MHz memory on my 10900K. So if you're sitting on some older, slower DDR4 memory, you could also consider swapping it out for some lower timing CL16 3600 MHz memory. Just make sure that you get at least 32 gigs, because 64 gigs is completely unnecessary and 16 gigs just isn't enough right now for Star Citizen. So did this help you decide and save you some money, or are you already sitting on a new monster rig like mine? Let me know down below either way, because I'm excited to hear what you decide to do and maybe what you've learned from my results. No matter what though, hope to see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.